Okay, it's all yours, Brooke. Take it from there.
All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today to talk about book publishing standards. And I'm here both as myself, but also as a representative of the Independent Book Publishers Association, where I sit on the board and where I chair the Advocacy Committee. And this initiative was set up by IBPA to try to put something forth to the industry at large that would serve as a checklist to measure a book against the checklist rather than a lot of other measures that are used in the industry right now, which is simply, for instance, trying to say, okay, well, that's a self-published book and this is a traditionally published book, and one is better than the other simply by the fact of it being a traditionally published book versus a self-published book. Right now, the industry is in flux so much, and so many great books are coming out on all models. My press is She Writes Press. I'm also the publisher of Spark Press, and I'll talk about that in a second, but we call ourselves hybrid publishing. And so because of all these different publishing models that are happening, one of the goals of the Advocacy Committee at IBPA was to put together this book publishing standards checklist and to make it more known that there actually are ways to measure a book's credentials and success beyond just who the publisher might be. And we're very interested in leveling the playing field for authors everywhere, and that's part of what this webinar is about and also what this initiative at IBPA is about. So this is one of our memes: judge a book by the book, not the business model. So right now, I feel like even if you are previously a traditionally published author, maybe you're a self-published author, maybe you actually have published in the hybrid model, a lot of people are more fluid today than they ever have been. And so it really actually benefits and serves us all to be adhering to these standards. This notion that the rising tide lifts all boats is where we come in here and believe that if we all can adhere to standards and make sure that we understand what makes a good book and really see that the merit of the book is, of course, the content. You know, this is a little bit of a difficult checklist because content will always be subjective. But what we can do is prevent all of these mistakes that were being made a lot early on by self-published authors. And I think what's happening is less and less of that is happening. Of course, there are still books that are poorly published, but I've seen a big shift in the industry, even in the last 5 years, where authors are really advocating for themselves and doing a better job of wanting to go out and publish books and use the traditional standard as the gold standard. So I encourage you all to go and download this checklist. Even now as we're talking, pull it up on your page, or rather on your computer, because we can follow along, because I'm going to be talking about some of the aspects of this checklist. And then we want it to be shared widely. It's something we're working and partnering with the Authors Guild in part because they're interested too in standards. It's important to all of us. And so if the Authors Guild is on board, and if we can get this in the hands of booksellers and reviewers and librarians, what eventually can happen is that people will start to say, oh, okay, well, does it meet all of these standards for a professionally published book? And that's going to be a lot better way to judge a book than currently what is happening, which is based on the business model alone, so that some books are just automatically considered lesser than because they might be self-published or hybrid models, and traditionally published books are considered automatically better than. And we really want to see that not be the case in the industry, but we have to give tools to the industry in order for that to be able to happen. And so that's part of what this whole initiative is, and it's also part of what we're going to be talking about today. So I've been in the industry for coming close to 20 years here. I started in 2000 in a small press here in Berkeley, and after that I spent 8 years as the executive editor at Seal Press, which is a press that has been eaten up a few times in the past decade, first by Avalon and then by Perseus, and now Seal is owned by Hachette. So I was firmly entrenched in that traditional space before I set out on my own to co-found She Writes Press. And She Writes Press, as I mentioned, is a hybrid publishing model. And what that means is that authors do pay for a publishing package with us, but what they get on the tail end is much higher royalties. And so it's more of an entrepreneurial model, and it is a model that is both successful, but also that has been met with some stigma in the industry because it's a pay-for model, and because some people really can't break free of the notion that there is this black and white space in publishing, either self-publishing or traditional publishing. And the fact of the matter right now is that there's all of this gray zone area, and it's scary for authors, and it's scary for any of us really in the industry, because there are predatory models, and then there are really models that are advocating for authors to be able to have a voice and to find alternate ways to get published. So we, of course, position ourselves as author advocates. We are author advocates. It's very educationally driven. And part of my big push for authors everywhere, whether you're self-published, hybrid published, and certainly whether you're traditionally published, you can be in this boat as well. But it's to advocate for yourself. And the traditional folks, maybe need a little less advocacy or education because the press is doing more on that front for you. But more and more authors are expected to know what's up and to really understand what makes a good book. And then certainly if you're self-publishing, all of this stuff is so pertinent to you. So then for the past 3 years, I've been a board member of the Independent Book Publishers Association. This has suited me really well because I am an advocate for authors. And what I love about what the Independent Book Publishers Association is doing is that they really are leveling the reading field. They are trying to educate authors. They are offering all kinds of resources and information. And it dovetails with Authors Guild. It's not the same services. It's much more indie focused, although certainly there are indie authors who are accessing and need the Authors Guild as well. But I think that they're complementary. And so if you're an indie author or interested in resources like the checklist and other things, please do check out IBPA's website. And then finally, I have a couple of books, What's Your Book and Greenlight Your Book. I write about writing, I write about publishing. And in both of my books, I touch upon the importance of standards. And I really do believe, of course, that the traditional industry that I was a part of for 13 years has the gold standard, and it is something to emulate. But what I don't believe is that only the best books are coming out of the traditional space. I know for a fact that excellent, amazing, competitive books are coming out of the hybrid and the self-publishing space. And so because of that, we do really, really need to have ways to measure a book that is not only about how people get published, but whether the book is good, obviously. And then secondly, whether it adheres to these standards. Because if you have an excellent book and it doesn't meet the book industry standards, then the industry people are going to look down upon it. So without further ado, we'll get into what this stuff looks like. So here's what the checklist looks like. Obviously very small for you to try to read on your computers right now. So please download it, as I mentioned. And the whole point here is that this would fit on a front and back page. So it's a lot. We tried to make this as reasonable as possible, but there's a lot to fit in. So you can check each of these boxes. You can see the things that are optional. It says, the dedication is optional, table of contents is optional. Lots of things actually are optional. And then the way that we chose to handle the quality of the writing was to give general guidelines. We certainly know that a checklist is not perfect for knowing or for being able to check a box that the writing is literary or, perfectly executed. But certainly you can read a couple of pages and see whether a book is riddled with typos. You can see cliches, that things are presented clearly. And so what we're hoping that industry people will begin to do is say, okay, I will take into consideration a book that meets all these standards and then read a few pages. And if it is typo free, and it reads well and it presents well, then we'll give it a chance. And so that's how we're handling content, although we realize that's less than perfect, but it's pretty good. So do download this and take a look as we move along. I'm going to talk about content, and I'm not going to talk about every single aspect of what you see on the checklist, but I am going to highlight some of the things that I think are important that really off the bat, like if someone were to pick up your book, and this happens all the time, maybe you take your book into a bookstore, or you show your book to an industry professional, or you send it for review. Some of the things that they recognize right away as qualifying your book as less than are these things that you might not even realize, because it's this whole truism that you don't know what you don't know. So the half title page is a big one, and I included this one because, as you can see, this is a pretty hand-drawn typeface. You know, it's not a font that was purchased. The designer who did this book drew this, and then we needed to replicate it for the half title page and for the title page. And so often I see people not doing that, not replicating it. And it is really important that your logo be on the half title page and that it match the style. And on the title page, it would have the publisher and possibly location. That's actually optional, but that this package look like it goes together is a big deal. I often hear people saying, or book designers rather, who are just designing books based on templates. And I find that problematic, because the whole idea is that your interior would be based on your cover design. And so you might even be integrating the fonts from the cover into your running heads, for instance. And so there is this stylistic match that you're looking for so that it is aesthetically pleasing. And part of what makes these books that we love so beautiful and real works of art is that they are individually done and created. And so I personally am not a huge fan of templates. I realize they work. I realize they're cheap. And I think they're fine for ebooks. But when it comes to a book, especially if it's a work of art or if it's something that you're hoping will be reviewed and shared and well loved, it matters to go this extra distance and to create something that flows. Let's look at the copyright page for a second. I mean, this is really just a list of all the things that need to be included, but so often this stuff gets left out. And that's one of the main things that people don't consider when they're looking at professionally designed books or considering designing their own book. I'll keep going back to this, you don't know what you don't know. But if you don't know that something needs to be included, you're probably going to leave it out inadvertently. And then what happens is that industry people look and then they see that something is missing. And then because it's missing, they know that it's not a professionally published book. And so this is, I've been on all kinds of panels over the years where people will come up to me afterwards and say, oh, well, I didn't know that I was supposed to do that. And that is, of course. So I am not saying that I blame those people for doing what they did. It's a steep learning curve to publish your own work, but it also is not that difficult, to go into any book that you own, look at the copyright page and see all of the things that need to be included. And so the industry checklist includes all of these long things, and how to format is a part of that, but making sure that you have even the Library of Congress control number, which She Writes Press has the SIP, which is, the cataloging program of the Library of Congress. It really only large publishers qualify for that, but even self-published authors can get an LCCN. And you do want to have that, because that means that you're registered with the Library of Congress. And it's just an extra layer of professionalism, as is owning your own ISBNs. So if you are a self-published author, whether you're printing with CreateSpace or Ingram Spark, we at IBPA and elsewhere, me and the Authors Guild would recommend this as well, to get your own ISBNs, to buy them through Bowker, because there's this level of ownership that you have over your own books when you register your book through the Library of Congress and when you own your ISBNs and you don't give that control over to someone like Amazon or Ingram. So let's look at these other important content standards. Chicago Manual of Style, which I reference here as Publishing's Bible. You really need to have your work edited, obviously, edited and copy edited. I would love it if every book got a developmental edit, a copy edit, and a proofread, and that those editors and proofreaders that you're working with would be adhering to Chicago Manual of Style. I see so many books that do not adhere to Chicago, and then the author says to me, oh, well, I grew up learning AP style, and that's fine, except the AP style is not book publishing style. And so again, part of this is just about not raising red flags for industry folks who open your book and they go, oh, well, this style is not book style, and so this person did not adhere to the standards of book publishing, and therefore it's an automatic red flag that you are probably self-published or other published, and you don't want to do that. You don't want to raise any flags. You want to just flow right into the system and be accepted and reviewed and have the all of the opportunities that your traditional counterparts might have. I said this before, to purchase your own ISBNs, and you can do that at myidentifiers.com. The running heads and page numbers are a big deal. I see lots and lots of self-published books that don't have running heads, which are, you know, like the author name or the book title that you often see running across the top of a book, you know, on any given page. And again, if you don't think about it and you don't really know what running heads are, you might be conscious of the fact that books have that and then still inadvertently leave it out of your own book. But if a industry person opens up that book and sees there's no running heads, it's generally, again, a red flag that, oh, this person is other published and you don't want that. Front matter and back matter. On the standards list, we put a lot of things as optional, like the table of contents, the dedication, even the acknowledgments and the author page technically would be optional, but I think the more front matter and more back matter you include, the better. Forgetting your author bio is a real missed opportunity. Not including acknowledgments is fine, but again, it's something that is done in book publishing. And so you want to have all of these elements that other books have, partly because you are following a tradition, and it's a tradition that is beautiful and works. And the whole stigma of self-publishing, in my opinion, has to do with all of these people who just created books that were substandard. And so creating books that are at standard or above standard is going to open up opportunities and is going to destigmatize other ways of publishing, which is important because there are all of these amazing books and authors who are publishing alternatively. So here's another one of our memes. I had said earlier, level the reading field. You can download these on IBPA's website if you like them. You know, if you're an indie author who is looking for some recognition or is agreeing with what I'm saying, like, yeah, you know, this is important stuff. Let's judge the book for the book. Let's level the reading field, because there are all of these amazing books out there that deserve to be judged for the books themselves. So I'm going to segue here into production. You know, like I said, I did not cover all of the content, but you can certainly look at the content and see what we put together. And we welcome feedback. This is a relatively new list. So if you feel like we really missed the boat with something, I'm open to hearing about it. Obviously, we're trying to keep everything on these 2 pages, so it's a little tough to include everything. That said, you know, if there's a glaring omission, please do let me know. Where production is concerned, I'm going to move into talking about interior design, but I'm also going to talk about cover design. So the main thing about interior design is that it's not graphic design. And I think a lot of people say to me, I mean, I hear this all the time, well, oh, my son is studying graphic design in school, or, oh, I have a friend who, you know, is a graphic designer and who has dabbled in book design. That's fine that you know those people and maybe they are good designers, but that doesn't mean that they know book design. I've seen so many book designs that end up looking like flyers, or they just don't have the right flavor to them. They don't use appropriate fonts. I can't tell you how many times people have said to me, I really want my interior to be Helvetica, you know, or Arial, because that's a font that they're comfortable with using in their day-to-day interactions, but those are not good book fonts. Knowing about kerning and leading, which I'll talk about in a second, Consistent running heads, which I already mentioned, and or feet, that they show up throughout, that they are consistent, that usually the left page, for instance, would have the title of the book, and the right page might have the author name, or the left page might have the book title and the right page might have the chapter title. And then, of course, you have to make sure that it's consistent and that you're not inadvertently running the wrong thing on the wrong page. So there's a lot of things to be keeping track of. The proper use of em dashes, hyphens, and ellipses, symbols, dingbats. I mean, there's all of these things that go into book publishing. And if I open a book and I see an em dash that is improperly formatted, it might be a typo, but if it's done throughout, then I know that someone didn't really know how to handle an em dash, and it's not consistent. And therefore, again, it is automatically flagged as not reaching the best practices of book design. Appropriate margins. This is another thing. I mean, so many books have wrong margins. They don't give enough space in the gutter. They don't give enough space for your thumbs on the outside. You're supposed to read a book and have margins on the outside because people actually hold books, right? And so they turn pages. And so you don't want your margins being too narrow. And then the importance of using standard trim sizes, which a lot of people don't think about because they think like, oh, well, I want to have a unique book. I want it to be, this oddly shaped size. But frankly, industry people don't like that. Booksellers and librarians find them hard to shelve. If they're really awkward, people just feel like you were being a little too renegade. I write in both of my books about renegade authors, and they're everywhere. And more power to you in some ways. Like, I kind of like renegade people, and I understand the impulse to be renegade and kind of do your own thing and be creative and think outside the box. But in book publishing, it does not and will not serve you, because it's an industry that is very entrenched in a particular mentality and way that things are done. And the best way to succeed is to emulate what has come before you and just write the best book you can write. So adhering to standard trim sizes, usually, unless you're doing some, art book, 4-color something outside of the sort of standard, then you are going to always be best off adhering to trim size standards. So I wanted to share a couple of design samples that I have. This is a book, what it should look like. I had to cut the margins a tiny bit. This book actually has a little wider margins on the left side, but my screenshots are imperfect. But what you can see up there on the running heads, The Fantastic Elastic Brain is the name of this book. And then it has this, strong title, and there's even some artwork in here, and the pagination is clear. The page numbers are running along the running heads at the top, but then on every beginning page, the page number is on the bottom. And that's another thing that you see a lot of times in books, where the page that you cross-reference in the table of contents, that single page number is always going to be on, not always, sometimes going to be on the bottom right, where the rest of the page numbers might run on the running heads. So again, if you know nothing about book design, you might say, well, why is that done? Partly it's tradition, and it's not the only way to do book design, but it's one of the reasons that I think working with a book designer who knows book design is an asset, rather than just plugging your book into a template that may or may not even do some of these things or know some of these things. Here's another example of a design sample, which this book was a 8x8 and actually is a 4-color book, but this is just an example of some text. You can see the justified text and the centered text, and then you can see the running feet. So the title of the book, Weaving Myself Awake, is the left-hand side. And then on the right-hand side is the introduction. And then if you were to flip these spreads, that Weaving Myself Awake would stay consistent throughout the book, and the right-hand side changes as we move into different chapters. But what I love about this, in addition to being aesthetically pleasing, is just how the word introduction is handled, because that matches the font on the cover. And I think that kind of thing, when you can match the fonts and make something a little more beautiful, it adds a lot of this visual element and sophistication to books that oftentimes is just, like I said, not going to happen in a templated design. So looking at interior fonts, this is just an example, looking at size of fonts. These examples, Bembo, Minion, Bookman, Jansen, Carlson, and I think that might be Carlson, and Garamond are some of the most popular interior fonts for book design. And so, you know, if you are interested in your own book design, just paying attention to this or looking at what the different possibilities might be. So this is just a quick visual before we move on. And then more on production. I mean, production is a big deal, and I think it's one of these places where people think, well, I'll just throw this through the production process and not spend very much money on it. And it really is a place where you could spend time and money, and maybe should spend time and money, because this is the bulk of the book. You know, if you have a gorgeous cover and then the interior doesn't look good, it is, you know, it says something about the book. So we're looking at, you know, I've been saying all along, working with someone who knows book design and not just plugging it into a template, considering the hierarchy in your subheadings. You know, if you have A, B, C level subs, that those be designed appropriately. Fixing bad breaks. This is a call for doing your proofreading in Pages. My press, She Writes Press, we actually do proofread, a final proofread before we go to layout. And so because of that, we have a checklist for our authors to go through the laid out book once it's in design Pages and check all of these things, you know, widows, orphans, bad breaks. But it's so important that once your book is laid out in book design, that you and maybe some of your trusted good readers, if not another proofreader, go through and check everything and make sure that there's nothing weird, and make sure that your running heads are correct and all of that. So it's really a bad practice, of course, to just flow a book into design, and just because you think the Word document was perfect, that therefore the book is going to be perfect. That's not always the case, because all kinds of things happen when a book gets flowed into the InDesign program or whatever other program your designer might be using. Use design elements to make your interior more interesting. I personally love this, and even in novels and memoirs, my presses use a lot of design elements and dingbats and, you know, interesting chapter openers. It adds a lot. You know, if you just have this kind of like, I mean, interior design is interior design, and sometimes it's just going to be pages, and that's fine. But there are things that you can do to make the interior more interesting. And I wouldn't overkill. You know, I often have authors who are like, oh, I want this crazy chapter opener and photos throughout, you know, and it's a memoir. And I say, you know, let's not do too much. You can go too far with all of that. So you want it to be classy. You want it to have photos and interior elements that enhance the book or make it fun or make it interesting without going into chaos. Check for uneven kerning, which is the space between letters, and check for uneven leading, which is the space between baselines. I mean, your designer should be doing this. You should not have to be proofreading this and looking for examples of kerning and leading problems. But kerning and leading problems happen, and frankly, they happen more on covers than they do in design books. But you will see, I mean, in interiors, excuse me, but you will see it, you know. And if you see that you have squished spacing, or if you see that there's uneven leading, that is something that the reader will feel, and you certainly can identify it and say, you know, is there a kerning or a leading problem? And then the designer can fix it while the book is in design before it gets printed, obviously. Let's talk about covers for a second. So covers, the text should be easily readable with the title, subtitle, and author name. A blurb is optional. This is a book on our current season that we specifically designed in this way to make room for a blurb. And so my cover designers are always looking for opportunities to leave room for a blurb because we like them. They do actually sell books, and it looks nice. And so right there in that left-hand upper corner, you will see a blurb on this book once it gets published. The design looks good thumbnail size. I mean, you can see or imagine, I guess, that this book is going to look good in a thumbnail size. This book, actually, if you wanted to look it up on Amazon, you would see thumbnail and you could see, okay, good, A Matter of Chance, Julie Maloney, these things pop out. You would be able to see it even at a smaller size. And that's the reason that this matters, is because these books are going to be on Amazon and people are going to be looking at them at a small size. And so that the colors will translate well into print and digital, you want to consider that, maybe even get a proof. I know a lot of people who just go ahead and order the books without getting a proof. And you especially do want to see a proof of your cover before you print, 500 copies, for instance. And you can do that even if you're printing through CreateSpace or Ingram Spark, because they offer you the opportunity to get a proof and to approve it. And I recommend that highly. If you're going through an offset printer, or if you have your own publisher, like She Writes Press, we approve our covers for our authors. And if you're with a traditional publisher, they're probably not going to send you a proof of your cover from the printer. And I think you can trust your publisher to do that for you. But if you don't trust your publisher, if you're working with a partnership situation and you're not sure, you can ask them to send you a proof, because it's just an extra cost. It might cost an extra $80 or whatever it is. And so, you can take a look at that depending on how much control you want to have over this part of the process. Finally, that the style fits your genre. This is so important, that you have a book that fits in your genre. And it speaks back to what I was saying about not being renegade. So many people think, oh, well, I'm just going to do something so outrageous. And so you have, you might see a genre fiction book, by which I mean, sci-fi or mystery or whatever it is, with something that doesn't at all look like sci-fi or mystery. And that is confusing to the industry people, and it's confusing to your reader. And so you want to have something that makes sense, that looks like other books in this genre. And a lot of people think like, well, I'm not being original, or this has already been done. I remember this author, when she first saw this cover, was like, oh, there are so many, novels of little girls on beaches. And I was like, yeah, but this is a compelling cover. There's something really interesting about it. The hair of this woman looking at this child, it suggests some kind of foreboding. And once the blurb is in there and tells you that this book is about a little girl that gets kidnapped, this is going to suddenly become a much more compelling cover. And so that is the power of a cover, and why blurbs sometimes matter a lot, because they can offer something about the book that maybe the title and the subtitle doesn't say. So that's something to keep in mind. With the back cover, all of these things, the price is competitive. I can't tell you how many self-published authors I'm seeing who are publishing books that cost, too much money. They're 250-page books. They should be $16 or $17, and instead they're $22 or $25. That is not good for your opportunity to be in a bookstore, or, for people to even review your book. BISAC headings, which usually appear in the upper left, and you can see we have personal growth and spirituality on this back cover. Those are our BISAC codes, which are category codes. The publisher name and or logo. So down on the left-hand side, bottom, you see She Writes Press, and we put our URL there. Visit us at shewritespress.com. We don't put the logo on the back, but we do put the logo on the spine. And some people put the logo on the back cover, and that's great. Some people put their author photo and bio on the back. Some people put social media links on the back, and I think those are all good opportunities. We chose not to on this book, but it was a conscious choice. So it kind of depends on what you're doing and what your own needs are. I often think that memoirs and novels don't really need to have an author bio on the back of the book, but sometimes, and especially if you're a person who's doing a series or has written a lot of books, then your bio and your image might actually be a selling point. But if they're not a selling point and the blurbs are going to be a higher selling point, then you might consider, loading it up with blurbs rather than your bio. Another point here for the ISBN being owned by you, not getting a free one. registering your ISBN with Bowker when you purchase it, and then that your ISBN appears in the standard form. You know, when you look above the barcode there, we have the ISBN with all the appropriate dash breaks. And sometimes people remove those thinking it doesn't matter, but it does. And then finally, second to final, the barcode has the price embedded. So if you look at the barcode, and this is on our checklist as well, your price point is there on the right-hand side where it says the number 5 and then $16.95 is the price. And oftentimes in self-published books, I see this actually in university presses as well. So this is something where you can actually be your own advocate in a traditional press. If you see 0000 following that number, usually it will say 90000. And what that means is that the publisher did not embed the price point, and that makes, again, it's a red flag. I know bookstore owners who look at that 90000 and they think it's a self-published book. So you want to have your price point embedded. And then finally, that your spine have the title, author, and publisher or logo. Oftentimes people are not including that information, and it just is something that stands out. Having a logo, if you're a self-published author, is a great thing to do. So finally, as we move toward the end here, cover design best practices. This is stuff to consider: matte or glossy finish, what's standard in your genre. Go down to your bookstore, go down to your library, feel the books in your genre and see which ones are more common. Your matte is often more common for memoirs and fiction, where glossy is more common for self-help. Make sure that it works as a thumbnail, which I've already said, but look at that, scale it down and see how it looks on your computer screen. Fit the design and style of other covers in your genre. Know by author. This is when we're looking at the name, right? And it just says Julie Maloney. It doesn't say by Julie Maloney. And I see this happening with self-published authors all the time, and it's an automatic red flag. So you're just basically trying to avoid these red flags. Oops, sorry, being a little crazy there. No fake blurbs. This one drives me crazy, but authors do it for some reason. They make up blurbs or they put Amazon reviews on the back covers of their books, and you just don't want to do that. And the industry is not a fan of Amazon per se, and so putting the words Amazon review or reader on the back of your book is not always a great thing to do. And in general, fake blurbs just don't make sense. And yet I see people doing it all the time because they think it's cute, but the industry doesn't think it's cute. Let's look at the paperback design samples. Just looking at all the elements here, what it includes. This is an author who you can see right above the barcode did include his social media links and his URL. And that is in part because of the work that he's doing. This is a self-help book. He's very much trying to brand his stuff and to have anyone who looks at his book see his social media and URL links there. And I think that is a good strategy. And I think this is a great cover. And look at the blurb by Seth Godin, which is a huge selling point and a major coup for this author. And so it's right there, front and center, strong title. And this cover, evokes something. And then here's the hardcover version of this, which again, has all of these standards. Usually you do have the bio information and photo on that back flap. If you turn this thing around and fold it, that would be your back flap. And then the description would be on the front flap. And so, if you're doing all of this stuff, the obvious thing to do is to go to any book on your shelf and look at how it's done, and then make sure that you're adhering to everything. But again, sometimes because you might not know what you don't know, you might not see something that is an important element. And that's where we're hoping the checklist will give you that opportunity, to literally check the boxes and make sure that you have all these little elements covered and that you're not missing anything that might ultimately down the road be a strike against you. Here's our final meme, let the book speak for itself, which I thoroughly believe, and IBPA advocates so much that we really need to be allowing for these amazing indie books to have a space alongside their traditional counterpoints. And it's simply a matter of, everyone having equal opportunity. And so I'm interested in moving to Q&A. I have the IBPA links here. Please check them out. Check my Facebook and Twitter out. And then I also want to thank Terry Ryder at Top Reads Publishing, Inc., because she provided some of the elements for this presentation, and she serves on the Advocacy Committee with me. Hi, Jennifer.
Okay, I'm back. So I will go ahead and jump into some of these questions. If you have a question that you haven't submitted yet, you can still do that using the Q&A button on your screen. So there were a few questions where people were a little confused about where to find the checklist. So online, if you could just tell them again. Yeah,
I'll just go back to that slide. It's on the IBPA website, www.ibpa-online.org. I mean, this is the long, if you're not seeing my screen, obviously this is a long URL, but it's /page/standards checklist. And I think if you go to the home page, I don't have it pulled up obviously, but it's either under advocacy or the standards checklist, that you should be able to see a link from the home page, I hope.
Okay. And then we can also, the Authors Guild will also put a link to it.
Great.
Somewhere with this webinar recording and everything. I'll add the link there so you guys can find it there as well.
Thank you.
The recording later this week. Okay. So this question is from Emily. She said, I'm curious about the standards of including the price in the barcode. Is that a standard because it looks normal, or is there another practical reason for it? She says, I've found it helpful not to have the price there as a self-published author, so I was surprised, dismayed to see it on the list.
Well, I guess the question is why you wouldn't include it. You know, I guess the rationale is that you think by not including the price point that they're going to set it for you. You know, that maybe the bookstore, for instance, is going to set the price for you. The issue is that bookstores and other places sticker, right? If they want to discount your book, they're going to sticker it. And on Amazon, you do set the price point. You know, so to me, I guess the question is simply like, well, what do you think you gain by not putting a price on your book? Because the publisher, whether you're self-published or traditionally published, sets the price point. And then the other thing about publishing is that it's all about price competition. And so, like, for instance, we price all of our memoirs and novels, you know, unless they are ridiculously long for some reason, at $16.95. And we do this to be price competitive. And so what I have booksellers have told me that if there is no price in the barcode, that what happens is that they don't know how to price it. And then they just price it. So I don't know. I just think it's a problem. And I think there's no reason for you not to price it. And I have also heard book publishing industry people say that they think it's one of the marks of a self-published book. So that is why we chose to include it.
Excellent. And to the next question from Vicky. How do I get an LCCN as a self-published author?
So I believe the link is pcn.gov.org. You could try that. I hope that works. And basically, there is a very simple, enrollment form. You know, you basically click on PCN, you say, yes, I want to apply for this. You have to enter in information about your book. So it does have to be designed. You have to know how many pages it is, and you have to put in like your title and subtitle and other information about your book, but it's pretty simple. And then it's a two-step process. And then once you fill out both of those, like the first form and the second form, then they email you with your LCCN, and then you stick that on your copyright page.
Okay. I'm gonna jump over to another question that is related to this here. Okay, they ask, I keep trying to figure out the CIPR LCCN. I've looked at it many times, but it's very confusing and it makes no sense. It is less confusing than it seems, or is there some way of you helping to solve this issue for them?
So you probably, I mean, I don't know anything about you, but you probably don't qualify for a SIP. And I think the confusing thing is that it's either or. You don't have a SIP and an LCCN. And I think that I'm blanking, someone can maybe help me here, what SIP stands for. I think it's cataloging in publication or something like that. And so basically big publishers qualify for SIP because it's a program through the Library of Congress. And they decided at some point that self-published authors could have LCCNs, which is just different but parallel. And so I don't know if the confusion stems from the difference between the two, but basically if you're a self-published author or you have your own imprint, then you should only apply for the LCCN. And what is confusing about it is that the only way to apply for an LCCN is through the PCN program. And frankly, I don't even know what that stands for off the top of my head. So if you go to pcn.gov.org and you apply for that pre-assigned control number, I think is what it stands for, what you get on the tail end is an LCCN. So I can totally understand why that would be confusing, because it looks like you're applying for a PCN, but once you go through the process, they shoot you an email with your LCCN. Once you do that one time, I think you'll find that it's easier than it seems. And you have to do it for every book. You know, that's another thing. It's not just like one time, you know, each book has its own LCCN number, or that's redundant, its own Library of Congress number.
Emily asks, I think I learned that fonts are copyrighted. If I'm using InDesign to lay out my book, do I have the right to use its fonts in my book, or am I supposed to pay someone to use one?
You do have to purchase fonts. So I know that there, you know, as far as standard fonts go, you can purchase a lot of really standard fonts for a very inexpensive price. So like where I had listed all of these fonts, I mean, I don't exactly know how that works, you know, in terms of getting Bembo, Minion, et cetera, but I think that you can buy all these fonts for really, really cheap. But once you start getting into really intricate, you know, different fonts. Like I've had my designers ask for approval to buy a font for $100. I think that's expensive for a font. A lot of these are bundled, but the answer is yes. And, you know, there are databases where you would buy fonts. And so you do want to make sure to cross your T's on that, because although it would be unlikely for these companies to come after you, they technically are registered and for sale, and as a designer you need to buy
them. Chris asks, I've noticed self-published books seem to have larger type and fewer words per page, which looks amateur to me. Is that just me? Is there a standard of words per page? A difference I see seems to be 300 words per full page self-published versus 360 words per page standard published. Makes the book more pages, heavier, or larger than it needs to be.
Good observation, Chris. I mean, if you go back to this sample, which is a 6x9, you know, I think this is pretty standard, and usually the fonts are smaller. I think what happens, honestly, is that self-published authors think that they should have a bigger typeface simply because they're not used to laying out books. And I agree with you. I mean, I have a lot of authors who request a bigger font size sometimes. Sometimes it's appropriate, you know, if you really are writing for an older readership, for instance. Like I have an author right now who's writing a book it's called Winter's Graces, and it is for people in later life. And she requested a bigger font size, and that feels appropriate to me. But most books are in this smaller, I mean, I think this is like 9.5 type, maybe 10, and that seems really small to people, and I think they kind of have a knee-jerk reaction like they should make it bigger. But you're right, it looks amateur and it doesn't need to be that big. So it's a consideration if you're designing your own books. You know, you might want to have a consultant, you know, look at this and say, does this look right? And people can tell. So it does matter It's one of these things about, not knowing what you don't know or feeling like you're doing the right thing and then inadvertently you're not.
And I guess related to that is, Francis has a question if you have any advice about an average word length for various genres.
Yeah, I mean, in general, right now, the trend is going shorter and shorter. Of course, I feel like people always say, well, what about the Goldfinch? What about, whatever longest book was just a bestseller? But if you're a newer author who doesn't have a lot of books under your belt, especially if you're a debut author, 80,000 words has been the gold standard. Genre fiction can run longer. Certainly, like sci-fi and these books that, take a long time to build up a world, fantasy, you might say 100,000. But really for memoir fiction, 80,000 and even less than that right now is increasingly becoming the standard.
It's a question from Emily. She said, is there any chance IBPA or the Authors Guild could advocate for removing the monopoly of Bowker ISBNs? I've heard that they are free in Canada, and it seems weird that they cost so much when there's no physical product.
Well, that's a great question, Emily. I will take it back to IBPA because I don't know. I think Bowker, serves a long and important role in the history of book publishing. It would be pretty hard to advocate for them getting rid of a major income stream, I'm sure. But I appreciate you raising it, and I'll see what I can find out.
It looks like we have one more here. Does She Writes provide publishing as a service? I have a backlist book that I'd like to put on Amazon as an ebook, but I don't really want to manage the production.
That's an interesting question that you raise. Right now, we are not doing e-only. And so it's something we've actually are looking into, but we will republish backlist books, but then it becomes a She Writes Press book. And so it is about, and what that means if you have a backlist book and you republish it with any publisher, whether it's She Writes Press or other, you are assigned, getting a new ISBN, putting that publisher's logos, perhaps it needs to be redesigned. So these kinds of considerations are a big deal. If you simply want to make your backlist book available as an ebook because you want it to live on forever and your publisher declared it out of print, that might be something you would consider doing on your own. But I'm open to having those conversations with anyone. I do consult authors on publishing strategy outside of just She Writes, and you can find me at brookewarner.com.
Okay, excellent. I think with that, it's about time to wrap it up. So thank you very much, Brooke. This was an excellent webinar and very useful. For everyone watching, we will have a recording on the Authors Guild website of this webinar later this week in case you wanted to look over it again. So thank you very much, Brooke.
Thanks to the Authors Guild. I appreciate your support.
All right, everybody have a great day.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for being here.